on behalf of all of us here this evening, Professor Aashique Iqbal, I extend a really warm welcome to you. On behalf of the Director General of the CSMVS Museum, as you know, we're based in Bombay, and our museum is 100 years old, 101 years old, and our museum society is 60 years old. So it gives me great pleasure in inviting you to address us here this evening, and as well on behalf of the Godrej Archives. You've been in touch with Brinda Patare, our Chief Archivist, and I greatly appreciate the spontaneity with which you agreed to give us this lecture. I'm not going to say too much this evening, except that Aashique Iqbal is Assistant Professor of History at Kriya University, but he was educated at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and has a DPhil from the Oxford University. He's written a really celebrated book on, quote, the aeroplane and the making of modern India, as you heard Jason mention. So thank you very, very much. I have one more small duty to perform before I hand you over to Brinda, is to thank those who help us with our technical team every time under the able leadership of Jason. So thank you all three members of our tech team for being with us here once again. And thank you, Professor Aashique, for doing this for us on behalf of the museum staff, the members of the Museum Society, and of course, my executive committee and myself. And thank you, Shweta. You will be controlling it from here onwards after the slides are over, and you will be controlling the Q&A. So I'll see you at the end of the lecture. And ladies and gentlemen, do enjoy this evening. Thank you so much. And over to you, Brinda.
Thank you, Dr. Firoza Godrej. Collaborating with the Museum Society of Mumbai and CSMVS is always a pleasure. And before we start, let me just quickly inform you about Godrej Archives a bit. Conceptualized in 1997 by late Saurabh Godrej, the then chairman of Godrej Group, and formally started in 2006, Godrej Archives is a corporate archive preserving the history of 126-year-old Godrej Group of companies. We archive histories of products, manufacturing plants, and people, and we are also trying to make it available for research and reference. Apart from preserving the collection for future, Godrej Archives also strives to communicate this history through exhibitions, publications, art installations, etc. And we have also started the Scholar in Residence program since 2018 to encourage research in business history. Godrej Archives has also instituted an annual lecture series to make people appreciate the value of archives and popularize the subject of business history. Since 2006, we have been collaborated with the Museum Society and CSMVS in this endeavor. And in 2020, along with the Museum Society and CSMVS, we also initiated an online Thursday Talk series in which we also tried and explore varied topics pertaining to business history and its connection with the socio-political and economic aspects. So today, we will explore yet another fascinating aspect and a small but critical role played by aeroplanes in India's transformation from British colony to an independent republic. Aviation, as you all are aware, played a key role in the dramas of independence, partition, and later on as well. Aeroplanes would ferry refugees and restore order during the turbulent partition of the subcontinent, and aeroplane was also seen as a key technology of sovereignty. The importance of aviation for independent India would be so profound that the leadership of the newly independent Dominion would become convinced of the need to nationalize civil aviation. There are many stories like these about the aviation, and we couldn't think of anyone most suited to tell us this story than Professor Aashique Iqbal, who in his book, The Aeroplane and the Making of Modern India, published last year by Oxford University Press, and he has explored multifaceted story of the aeroplane in this book. And without further ado, we are all keen to hear him. So I invite Professor Aashique Iqbal to deliver a talk. Over to you, Aashique.
Thank you so much, Brinda, for that kind summary of my book. Special thanks also to Dr. Firoza Godrej for her introduction as well, and to the Godrej Archive as well as to the Chhatrapati Shivaji Museum for having me here today. So I'm basically, as we've discussed, I'm an assistant professor of history at CREA. I sort of teach and write about history, in particular modern history. And when I set out to write this particular book, what I was trying to do was to answer a question which so far no one has worked on, which is what has been the role of the aeroplane in Indian history? In particular, what has been the role of the aeroplane in India's sort of transformation, in India's journey from being a colony to its emergence as a republic, right? What has this particular technology done for India? But also, what has this particular India done for this particular technology? So that is sort of broadly the thrust of my work. I will spend the next 35 odd minutes talking about it. And when I do so, I plan not to necessarily sort of make use of a very large wall of text. I'm sure we've all had, we've all had a particularly long day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk us through the sort of wider story that my book tries to tell us, but do so mainly using images, which might be of some interest to the audience gathered over here. So let's begin, of course, at where most of us are based today, which is at Bombay. This is a photo of J.R.D. Tata, considered by many to be sort of the father of Indian aviation. It's taken at Juhu Aerodrome on the 15th of October, 1932, which is the day when the first Indian airline company, Tata Air Services, basically will fly a sort of a parcel carrying postage from Karachi via Ahmedabad to Bombay. So Tata was quite keen, as I'm sure many of you know, on establishing an air service. In order to do this, he'd been sort of trying quite hard after the First World War and sort of speaking to the government. He'd also kind of hired the guy you see on the right to him over here, the somewhat tall gentleman, who's the South African pilot hailing from the Royal Air Force. By the name of Neville Vincent. Neville Vincent is going to be the manager of Tata Air Sons and eventually sort of Air India itself. So the thing is that both Tata and Neville Vincent were quite unhappy overall with the state of government subsidies for aviation. Though the government allowed them to start an airline, it didn't provide them with all the sort of things that you need to have an airline. They didn't provide them with aerodromes, with meteorological facilities, with refueling facilities. Very famously, on this particular flight, the first flight of an Indian airline from from one destination to another. The refueling that happened at Ahmedabad happened on, the back of a bullock cart. So basically, petroleum was brought, in barrels, which were sort of loaded into a bullock cart and sort of used to refuel the aeroplane. So both Tata as well as the other major airline, which was an airline called Indian National Airlines, sort of another big air company that was set up at this point in time. Both of them were quite unhappy with the prospects for aviation in India. The government was not really overtly supportive of airlines and of sort of aviation companies as a whole, with one exception. And that exception was that the government was quite keen to connect Britain to its colonies in Southeast Asia, as well as to Australia. So there were really good aerodromes at places like Karachi, Bombay, Delhi, Jodhpur, Calcutta. But it was much easier to fly from one side of the British Empire to the other than it was to fly within India itself. So basically, the British government had not really provided India with the wherewithal to establish, successful airline companies, and had no intention of connecting the country itself by air. The situation for the Indian Air Force was much worse, right? So in this particular image, you can see, a sort of inspection that's going on of Indian Air Force personnel. The Indian Air Force was established, at least by law, in the same year as Tata flew his sort of first flight to Juhu. Its first squadron was established on the 1st of April, 1933, the subsequent year. But again, the British were not particularly keen on supporting Indian aviation. And the reason for this was quite simple. Indian politicians felt that aviation would basically enable India to eventually become free. If India had access to aeroplanes, then it would have the capacity to defend itself. And that, combined with the Indianization of things like the civil service and the officer corps in the army, would basically place India in a good position to become independent. Conversely, Indian politicians like Jawaharlal Nehru were deeply concerned about the possibility that India may not end up having its own air force. They felt that if India did not have an air force, even if it became free from Britain, it was only a matter of time before it was either conquered by some other country that had an air force, or more likely forced to rely on Britain, and that way to continue its dependence on Britain, even if it got formal independence. The reason for this logic and reasoning is quite straightforward. Aeroplanes and especially military aeroplanes at this point in time were seen as some of the most dangerous weapons of their time. Nehru, for instance, commented that aeroplanes could destroy entire armies, drop gas on cities to kill millions of people, could sink fleets. So without air forces, countries that did not have air forces could not truly be independent. So Indians put a lot of pressure on the British. Indian politicians put a lot of pressure on the British to allow India to establish an air force, which they did, as I mentioned, in 1932. But the British, of course, had no intention of providing India substantial air force. They only intended to provide India a token air force. Initially, they thought of providing about 4 aeroplanes. But then they realized that would be uneconomic, so they decided to allow India to have sort of a squadron of aeroplanes, which is roughly 16 aircraft. And the aircraft that they provided were quite poor, right? These were some of the worst airplanes of the time. They were already outdated. The airplane in this picture is called the Westland Wapiti. British pilots used to call it the Water Pity, because it was such a sort of, such a defective and old aircraft. The Westland Wapiti had no it had no seat belts for the air gunner. So the pilot had a seat belt, but the air gunner would be the guy who'd sit sort of at the back of the at the back of the airplane. If you can see where my sort of mouse is pointing, he would basically be chained into place. The aeroplane had to be pushed before it could start. Its engine was not sufficiently powerful for it to sort of take off on its own, so it had to be pushed by hand by men on the ground before it could start. But perhaps the most interesting fact about the Westland Wapiti is that very often it did not have radio, and the means by which pilots using the Westland Wapiti communicated with people on the ground was to carry pigeons with them. They would basically carry caged pigeons with them, write their messages, and then throw the pigeon out of the aeroplane so that it could then fly back to people on the ground and convey their messages. Obviously, the British had no intention in these circumstances of providing India with a modern or large air force, but that was going to change when the Second World War broke out. Now, the outbreak of the Second World War quite simply changed the entire calculus of British rule in India, right? Whereas earlier, the British were quite convinced that they were going to hang on to India for a very long time. Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy, for instance, believed that the British might continue to be in India until the year 2000, and that perhaps in the 2000s they would first start having British viceroys might leave, and we might have Indian viceroys, but India would still be part of the British Empire. Whereas these kinds of views prevailed before the war. When the war broke out, Britain was in real danger of losing its Indian empire, right? It seemed very likely that India was going to be attacked. Initially, there were fears that India would be attacked by Russia, but these were subsequently replaced by fears that India might very well be attacked by Japan. The Japanese, as many of you know, were able to make their way to Burma. Eventually, in 1944, they would come all the way up to Assam. So the British desperately needed to sort of expand whatever air forces they had at hand, including the Indian Air Force. So they went on a sort of large-scale expansion drive, hired as many Indians as they could, expanded the Indian Air Force from 1 squadron to 10 squadrons. So it went from being a force of about 400 men to being a force of about 16,000 men in 5 years. They were also able to mobilize, as you can see in this image, India's very large pools of manpower, right? They were able to sort of get millions of Indian laborers to build those aerodromes, which Tata and Neville Vincent had been sort of pleading for before independence. So something like 400 aerodromes will be built in a 5-year period. The Indian Air Force itself will sort of be expanded. And all of this will cumulatively mean that by the end of the Second World War, aviation was in a much, much better situation than it was at the beginning. This was true for military aviation, of course, as I've already mentioned. India now could boast, a large air force of about 10 squadrons, enough to keep a newly independent country free without necessarily relying on foreign aid. But it was also much more critical, or certainly very, very critical um, to civil aviation, right? Because after the war, what was going to end up happening was that a lot of the guys in the Air Force were going to sort of, retire from the Air Force and take up sort of civil aviation. A lot of the aeroplanes that the Americans left behind from the war were going to sort of be sold quite cheaply. So Indian aviation expanded just massively as a result of the war, and India was well on the way to independence. This is also partly because of a lot of the forces that will be unleashed by the war. Indiscipline in both British and Indian military forces, large-scale sort of nationalist movement, and a general sort of exhaustion on Britain's part at the prospect of holding India. So in the second chapter of my book, I talk about India's independence, but also about the thing that accompanied Indian independence, of course, which was the partition of India in 1946-47. We can start by looking at this image, a very familiar image to many of us. At least the locale is quite familiar. This, of course, is the Red Fort at Delhi, and we can basically see the Indian Air Force personnel sort of arrayed at the bottom of this image, and at the top of the image we see a very large, flight of about 9 aircraft flying over the Red Fort. Now, this was part of the parade that accompanied Indian independence, but there's something interesting about this image, and this is that the aeroplanes in this image are not, in fact, Indian at all. These are 4-engined bomber planes. The Indian Air Force had no 4-engine bomber planes. So what these actually are Royal Air Force aircraft, right? So we see that the British were in certain ways participating in this parade that spelt the independence of India. This might seem strange to us today, given the adversarial relationship between the British and the nationalists who succeeded them, but it wasn't so strange at the time. In fact, a lot of British administrators felt that even if India were to gain independence, it would continue to be sort of quite closely associated with Britain as part of the Commonwealth. India may now have aeroplanes, but it didn't have a nuclear bomb, and it would have to basically continue to rely on Britain for for being part of sort of Britain's nuclear umbrella. So the hope was very much that India and, as we'll see in a moment, Pakistan would basically continue to support Britain even after they became independent. But this, of course, was not to be. The other belief was that there would basically be a dependence on the part of India for aircraft and aircraft parts and aircraft trainers, which again was something that India did not necessarily go for. So we see that even though India became independent on the 15th of August, it would only be 5 years later, in 1954, that an Indian would come to lead the Indian Air Force, that Indians would actually sort of completely Indianize the Air Force. And at that point, India also started importing many of the aircraft parts and indeed aircraft themselves from countries other than Britain. So Britain's interest in India will continue, and its involvement in India will continue at least for 5 years, after independence. Another group of people, of course, who took part in this parade were members in this sort of air flight parade, were members of the Pakistan Air Force, right? So Pakistan had just been sort of established, and it was going to have its own Air Force, the Royal Pakistan Air Force. India had gotten the title of Royal for the Indian Air Force during the Second World War because it had performed so well. The King Emperor had recognized it as being a Royal Air Force. So after independence, there was going to be a Royal Indian Air Force, which would serve India, and a Royal Pakistan Air Force, which would serve Pakistan. And the RPAF pilots were also sort of part of this Independence Day parade, again reflecting a belief which was quite widespread at the time, that India and Pakistan, in fact, were going to be friends, that they were not going to kind of, have a strained relationship, but rather that they would have the kind of relationship that existed between Australia and New Zealand, again, two colonies that were sort of neighbors and that had formerly been ruled by the British. But of course, this was not to be. And the reason this was not to be, of course, is what we can see from this image. This is, of course, an image of partition, of the very vast swaths of people moving on bullock carts and on foot, from one dominion to the other. So as everyone I'm sure here is aware, British India was divided between India and Pakistan, and many Muslims from northern India sort of fled to Pakistan, while many non-Muslims, especially Sikhs and Hindus, fled from what was becoming Pakistan to India. Now, aeroplanes were going to play a very central part in this whole process of millions of people relocating as a result of partition. One of the things they will do, of course, is that the Indian Air Force will play a very key part, patrolling and taking photos, as you can see from this one, of these millions of people moving around. But perhaps the most important thing that aeroplanes will do in this particular crisis is that they will be used to evacuate very important government officials. Government officials who are important for facilitating the large-scale movement of people between India and Pakistan. Now, in early 1947, no serious plans had been made for facilitating the mass migration of millions of people. It was completely unthinkable that Punjabi farmers would leave their land, that Sikh farmers might leave the holy lands, that were quite central to them, including places like the birthplace of Guru Nanak, to move further east. It was also quite unthinkable that Muslims from places like Delhi, where they had been around for hundreds of years, would leave from Delhi to move west to Punjab. So no real plans had been made for the transportation of millions of people, and all the officials who you need to carry out this kind of mass population transfer, people who are in the military, people in the postal services, people in health, people in the police, all of these officials were often in the wrong country. So almost the entirety of what would become the government of Pakistan was based in Delhi, and almost all the people who would sort of serve or a very large chunk of the people who would serve in the Punjab government were based in what was now sort of going to become Pakistan. So what needed to happen was that these elite officials needed to sort of be evacuated alongside their families, and this was carried out initially by the Indian Air Force as well as by airline companies, but very soon it became clear that this was not going to be possible at all. So India and Pakistan both ended up paying very large amounts of money to British airline companies to come and fly out a bunch of people. The total number of people who were evacuated during partition is probably 0.01% of the number of people who were transferred in partition. It's something in the region of 50,000. We don't really know for a series of reasons because there are different counts. But the wider point is that these 50,000 people were often going to be very important for that transfer of populations that was going on the ground. And without aeroplanes, if they had to travel on by train or by motor vehicles, it's very likely that they would have had to make a very dangerous journey, which maybe many of them may not have been able to survive themselves. So aeroplanes were quite important in facilitating partition, even though the role they played was very, very small. This is all the more sort of striking given what we know of the history of the Indian Air Force and of Indian aviation in general at this point in time, which is that the Indian Air Force at this point in time, as I already mentioned, was being divided. It was being divided between two dominions. So you had sort of, as I mentioned, the Royal Indian Air Force and the Royal Pakistan Air Force. Men who had served together were sort of asked to choose which country they'd like to sort of serve in. As you know, many Hindus and Sikhs sort of chose to serve in India, whereas many Muslims chose to sort of serve in Pakistan. But the picture was not always clear cut. There were often people who had family in one country or the other, and the situation for minorities who were not Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh was also unclear. So the Indian Air Force had a lot of Anglo-Indians, It had a lot of Parsis. So who they should sort of serve with, also was a question that was painful and difficult for many people in the Air Force to take on. But what's interesting about this particular situation is that the first squadron, the squadron I said was sort of established in 1933, the first squadron of the Indian Air Force was taken over by, it was given to Pakistan in the division of assets that happened. As we know, India and Pakistan divided their armies. They also divided their air forces. And when this division ended up happening, a lot of the men, the first squadron which ended up going to Pakistan was immediately disbanded. Pakistan had no intention of taking on the history that came with this squadron, a squadron that had existed for 12 years, that had performed very well in World War II, but also a squadron that was deeply secular by nature. So they kind of disbanded it immediately. Where India did not have a first squadron, it would eventually raise one, right? But what's interesting about the re-raising of Squadron Number One, which happens in the 50s, is that the motto of the squadron was changed. So the squadron was initially known as the Squadron Number One's motto initially was "Ittihad mein Shakti hai," which means there's strength in unity. Ittihad, as you know, is an Urdu word, and Shakti is a sort of Sanskritized Hindi word. So this combination of these two words was meant to, in certain ways, reflect the unity of the two communities, India's two largest communities. But when India re-raised Squadron Number One, its motto was changed to "Ekta mein Shakti hai," which tells us something about the changing culture of the Indian Air Force at this point in time. Though I must point out that the IAF remained and arguably continues to remain the most inclusive of the three armed forces. It's the only armed force to have sort of been led, by a Muslim, and it is a force that's deeply cosmopolitan in outlook. Nevertheless, the scars of partition are something that is worth pointing out to. So. Even as the IAF was emerging out of the trauma of partition, indeed, even as it was undergoing the trauma of being partitioned as an institution, something very strange happened, which is that there was the outbreak of war in Kashmir. So men who had served together in the Indian and Pakistani Air Forces as part of the Royal Indian Air Force before independence were now pitted against each other as a conflict between Pakistan and India and Kashmir broke out. I'm sure many of you are aware, but without aeroplanes, it's very likely that the outcome of the Kashmir conflict would have been very, very different. The conflict began arguably with the entry of intruders into Kashmir, backed by Pakistan, and the hope was that these sort of Pashtun proxies would be able to essentially overrun Srinagar and take the all-important Kashmir Valley before Indian forces were able to arrive. Indian forces traveling by road would have taken several days to reach these positions. So essentially, Pakistan hoped to provide India with a fait accompli. What they did not anticipate was that India would be able to call on all its air resources, not just its military resources, but its civil air resources as well, to ferry troops to Kashmir. So you can see in the image, in the image over here again, if you're able to sort of see my mouse, you can see an aeroplane in the background. That is not an Indian Air Force aeroplane. That is very obviously a civilian aeroplane. It's one of the many civilian aeroplanes that were mobilized by the government of India on an emergency basis to send troops to come into Kashmir and to sort of stop Pakistan's proxies from being able to take the region. Now, the war in Kashmir, of course, would continue. I make a somewhat complicated argument about it in my book, but just to put it very shortly, the war in Kashmir was not a full-scale conflict in which India and Pakistan deployed all their forces, because if they had done so, it would very likely have bankrupted both countries while also causing a very large communal conflagration in countries that were still very deeply sort of affected by the violence of partition. So what the aeroplane basically allowed India and Pakistan to do was to fight each other in ways that were less direct and therefore less escalatory, at least for the better part of the years 1947 and 1948. By the end of this period, Pakistan grew desperate, and began to see India's attacks in Kashmir, including those attacks that were sort of carried out by the Indian Air Force, as being deeply escalatory. So they prepared for a full-scale conflict. The reason why the Indian and Pakistani governments, as many historians have pointed out, the reason why they basically kind of decided not to escalate the war further was because they simply could not afford to. And so the aeroplane, as I argue, played a very important role in containing the Kashmir conflict and keeping it small, and in eventually causing, or at least indirectly helping cause, a ceasefire. For my fourth chapter, I talk about something that's a little out of the chronological order. Instead, I take a thematic approach, and I talk a little bit about aviation in the princely states. Now, if there were two acts, if we look at Indian aviation as civil and military, a third way of looking at it at this point in time is also princely. The princes will play a very, very important role in the promotion of aeroplanes in India. A lot of this engagement with aviation has been criticized as basically being just rich men who wanted to sort of buy the latest toys. That they were not very different from the billionaire class today, that owns private jets. But I argue that actually the princely states need to be looked at as states, as using air technology in order to basically put forward their agendas. And they had different agendas, the most important of which was the one of maintaining their independence, both from the British and later on from independent India. I talk about three princely states. Jodhpur, Hyderabad, and Jodhpur, Hyderabad, and Mysore. We don't really have time to go over all three, so let me just talk very briefly about Jodhpur. Jodhpur, of course, was ruled by Maharaja Umaid Singh. If any of us have been to Jodhpur, we might have potentially visited Umaid Bhavan, which is sort of named after him. So Maharaja Umaid Singh played a pretty critical role in promoting aviation in his state. He saw, as you can see from these two images, aviation as a means of portraying himself as a modern guru. Right, one of the big criticisms of the Indian princes by nationalists and to a certain extent by the British was that they were anachronisms. Right, they were things from a different bygone era. They didn't have any place in the modern world, so they should not have power. But as you can see over here, he is a man who was not only a very capable administrator but also a gifted pilot, and he was able to sort of invest pretty extensively in aviation. Over here, we have an image of the Maharaja in the foreground, aeroplanes at the top, and his sort of coterie behind him. He invested pretty heavily in aviation, built aerodromes, made Jodhpur a very important international airport. He helped pass laws, that would change the way in which sort of aviation operated in the princely states. But most important, as we can sort of see him here in his uniform, he was a Royal Air Force pilot. He sort of actually wanted to serve in World War II when it broke out. The British were not willing to let him do that. His Rajput pride was sort of deeply hurt by this, but he nevertheless played a very important role in the Second World War in the realm of aviation. He writes a very important report that will help improve conditions in the Indian Air Force. He helps improve recruitment. He and Nawab Hamidullah of Bhopal will sort of work tirelessly to promote India and the Indian Air Force in the course of this particular conflict. So we see that the princes are actually quite an important part of the story of aviation, and their role should be taken more seriously. Even if we look today at the major sort of aviation hubs and things in India, if they are not one of the metropolitan cities, it's very likely that they are places that had some kind of princely control. So Jodhpur is a very important air hub. Hyderabad is a very important air hub. Mysore, as many of you know, is where Hindustan Aircraft Limited starts. It later becomes Hindustan Aeronautics. So the princes play a really, really important role, and that's something that we should take into consideration when talking about aviation. Chapter 5 is the final chapter where I look at the 5 years after independence and before nationalization. I talked briefly about a bunch of developments that happened. Unfortunately, we don't really have the time to go into them. But just very broadly, these include India signing treaties with other countries about how aviation should be used. It includes India and Pakistan having a sort of face-off over Bengal, which will culminate in India's victory, but which will also lead to an arms race between the two countries. But finally, the final thing that I do talk about, and which is perhaps the thing that interests a lot of people, is the question of nationalization, right? Over here we can see Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, along with Indira Gandhi on his left, Vikram Sarabhai on his right, and an aeroplane in the background. Quite sort of an interesting man, and somebody who was quite keen to nationalize aviation, but by no means somebody who stood alone on the idea of nationalization, right? Nationalization, the idea that the government should control all the airlines, becomes a very popular idea at this point. It's supported by the Congress, it's supported by the communists. It's widely seen as a natural development, just as natural as today we sort of consider privatization today to be a natural development. So in exactly the same way, the orthodox belief at this point in time, across the country, across political lines, was that the government should hold control of air companies. Now, one of the big reasons that's been given for this is quite simply that these air companies were doing very badly financially. So it made financial sense for the government to take them over, because the government was in any case subsidizing them so much that it was critical that it should sort of, it should handle it itself. But I make a different argument, while not dismissing the fact that these air companies are doing badly. In fact, almost every air company, with the exception of, of a handful like the Tatas and Deccan, were doing really badly at this point. I do argue that it's worth looking at aeroplanes through a security rather than a finance lens. And from all the things I've told you already, in terms of aeroplanes being really, really important in partition, in the war in Kashmir, in that crisis which I briefly referenced in Bengal, it becomes very clear to the government that it must control, aviation, and that civil aviation is just as important as military aviation. There's, in a country like India, where at this point in time there are less than 100 aeroplanes all put together, with the Indian Air Force and Indian airline companies put together, the aeroplane is simply too important a tool to be left in private hands. So what ends up happening is that Nehru's government will end up sort of nationalizing airlines. That will start a whole saga that, as many of you know, will lead to the creation of an Air India, which is led by JRD Tata, and Indian Airlines, which is sort of led by by other people, and which is an amalgamation. There's a long story over there to be told, but this is broadly where I bring my story to an end, quite simply because this is a point in time where we see a different phase of aviation history opening, a phase where all planes are controlled by the government. So just very quickly, what are the conclusions? What are the broad conclusions we can take away from the story? One is that the aeroplane, of course, played an important role. It was by no means a technology that wasn't critical. In fact, it was so critical that it had to be prioritized. Its importance was sort of known, by the government, which sort of nationalized it. And to study the aeroplane is to look at how the idea of sovereignty is constructed, right? Today, the Indian Union, the Indian Republic, is something that we have very clear ideas about in terms of territoriality, in terms of constitution, in terms of where India is and what it stands for. But you have to understand that for much of the period before independence, it was just an idea. So how do you sort of concretize an idea? How do you think about sovereignty? The aeroplane is an important indicator of the ways in which Indian leaders thought about it. But it was not just leaders, Indian nationalists, primarily sort of Congress leaders, who were thinking about, about aeroplanes. Other people who also wanted to have independence, often from India, thought about aeroplanes as being really, really important. Pakistan was very deeply invested in aircraft. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was one of the two guys who writes the report, actually, that will in some ways contribute towards the establishment of the Indian Air Force. So Pakistan was very keen. Jinnah met Isfahani and asked him to sort of help set up what would later become Pakistan International Airlines. So it was quite clear that aeroplanes are going to be quite important to connect East and West Pakistan, which was going to be separated by 1,000 kilometers or so of Indian territory. But it was not just Pakistan, it was the princes as well. The princes saw aeroplanes as a way to establish their governments, to kind of keep their own legitimacy, to kind of establish independence. In fact, Hyderabad will try to establish its own air force. When it's not able to establish its own air force, it will try and use aeroplanes to smuggle arms. It will hire a Australian smuggler called Sydney Cotton, who kind of smuggles a lot of arms, from Pakistan into sort of Hyderabad, when Hyderabad makes its abortive bid for independence from India. So the aeroplane is quite critical to looking at the ways in which Indian nationalists thought about sovereignty, in which Pakistani nationalists thought about sovereignty, and in which the princes thought about some kind of independence or autonomy after the British left the subcontinent. Finally, why are we interested in this particular story and at this particular juncture? Well, one of the reasons is that this story helps us understand the ways in which poor countries deal with technology, right? Now, so far, most of the histories of technology, not just aviation, have been histories of those rich countries that have most of the technology. But in practice, actually, most countries are not rich, and most countries actually have very little technology. So the way they use this has to be prioritized carefully. It has to be thought about carefully. So when we look at the history of India and the aeroplane, we see parallels between its history as well as the history of other countries that became independent around the same time, or sort of went through decolonization. We see that Peru also has a lot of similarities with India. They also sort of nationalize their airline, then they privatize it, then the airline sort of goes out of business. Egypt also, the story, if I were to just sort of change some of the names and dates, or blank out some of the names and dates, the story bears incredible similarities. So we see certain general trends. We see all these countries believed in nationalization, then now they all believe in sort of privatization. So it helps us build up a story of technology that isn't just the story of the rich countries in the world. It's very easy to write a history of the United States or Germany or France, and its engagement in the aviation, but it's not typical, right? It's not a story that's typical of the history of most of the world. The history of most of the world is very similar to the history of India, and early India's sort of attempts at engaging with aviation. So I will sort of stop over there. I'm happy to take questions and answers as they may come. Thank you everyone who has stayed this far to listen to this talk. I'm very happy for having delivered it. Thank you.